Good morning, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Liz Johnston, and I'm an associate attorney in Verrill's Employment and Labor Group. Joining me today is Beth Smith, who is of counsel in Verrill's Employment and Labor Group. We're both very excited to be here with you for our presentation this morning on romance and relationships in the workplace. As many of you know, Verrill's Employment and Labor Group has historically hosted an in-person full-day annual seminar for our clients and guests at the beginning of the year. However, with the pandemic going on the last 2 years, we've pivoted to an online format with monthly webinar presentations on various labor and employment issues to help you all with continuing to decipher and apply the ever-evolving world of labor and employment law. Today's presentation is the second installment in our 2022 series, and next month's installment will take place on Thursday, March 17th. So mark your calendars for that. That session will be presented by Ken Ginder and Sam Baldwin in Verrill's Executive Benefits and Compensation Group, and will be titled "Who's in Charge? ERISA Benefit Plan Compliance Starts with Sound Fiduciary Governance and Training." So I'm sure that'll be a very valuable presentation next month. Just as some additional information for today, the presentation materials will be posted in a link in the chat. Feel free to access those. And we will also be sharing the SHRM and CLE credit information there as well. The program's been approved for 1 SHRM and 1 CLE credit. In addition, the webinar will be recorded, and that recording will be available in a few days. Our follow-up email to you will include all the links to the materials that we're using today, as well as the webinar recording. Lastly, please note that your microphones are on mute during the presentation this morning. We do plan to have time for some questions at the end of the program today, but if you have a question at any point during the presentation, please feel free to drop that question in the chat, or go ahead and use the question and answer button at the bottom of the presentation screen. We'll try to get to those questions as we go, as time permits. With that, I think that's all we have for housekeeping. So we will jump into today's content. Next slide, please. So as you know, today, of course, we're talking about romance and relationships in the workplace. And as part of that discussion, we're going to focus on 3 primary areas. First, we're going to talk about what makes workplace romances and relationships something that you need to know about and care about in your role in your organization. What's unique about these types of relationships, and what is it about the work environment that's a unique factor in fostering these relationships? We'll next talk about the legal liabilities that could potentially result from workplace romances and relationships. The goal here is going to be to give you both a better understanding of the foundation for the legal claims that could arise, as well as how to identify potential issues that may lead to those claims in the future, so that you can issue spot day to day. Lastly, we'll dive into some practical guidance, best practices for addressing the many issues that we'll talk about today arising from workplace romances, including tips to, related to policy creation, performing investigations, those types of things to help you address when issues arise. I believe also we're going to start out with a poll at this point, and just to get a sense of all of your comfort level here and your experience with these situations, we'd like to run a poll asking, have you had experience with or handled a situation involving a workplace romance or relationship in your role? And I think if the poll should pop up. So we'd love for you to participate in that, just to, like I said, get a sense of what your experience level is here. And I'll share those results in just a moment. Okay, so it looks like about 40% of you answered yes, that you have had experience handling a workplace romance issue, and 60% not yet. So that's a really interesting sort of 50-50 split here. So I think both groups of you, depending on your experience level, will really gain a lot in terms of content, or gain a lot from this presentation that'll help you sort of understand the issues and be able to address those in the future if you haven't addressed them already. Next slide, please.
All right, hello, welcome. I'm Beth Smith. I'm of counsel at Verrill in the Labor and Employment Group. And I am going to start us off by defining the issue and some of the risks. So we've all heard of, I don't really like the term, but you've probably heard the term like the work husband or work wife. I mean, that's when you have a close collegial relationship with a colleague where you feel comfortable bouncing ideas off them, and perhaps you do run out for a cup of coffee. But that's a friendship, a collegial relationship. So what we're talking about today is more than that. Office romances, even between consenting adults, can give rise to a host of liability issues for an employer, as you can imagine. Among the complications that can arise include the potential for accusations of favoritism, discrimination, retaliation, claims of sexual harassment or assault, claims of hostile work environment and general disruption of the workplace, as well as morale issues for coworkers or team members of the pair that are engaging in the relationship, and even damage to the overall reputation of the company should something not go well or not be affirmatively and promptly addressed in a forward-facing way. An employer can't really be expected to manage or monitor every relationship that begins with a workplace collaboration, but might lead to a romance outside of the office. But trying to prohibit, not only trying to prohibit all fraternization, it's just not collaborative, it's not reasonable. What we're going to talk about today, though, is when the outside relationship moves inside the realm of the office, and what that can mean as far as possible liability for the employer for claims from perhaps a spurned lover, an offended or harassed coworker, or even a vendor or a client who might become entangled in the sort of office visit romance. You know, as awful as it is, I remember early in my career, folks rushing to the window when the FedEx guy would come in the summer because he was handsome. And I thought that was kind of ridiculous, but it happens. In a 2021 study, the Society for Human Resource Management found that more than 1/3 of workers have been or currently are involved in an office romance. And believe it or not, COVID has not slowed this down. 25% of workers either started a new office romance during the pandemic or continued an existing romance. So obviously, COVID has not put a damper on office romances. And in fact, it may have prompted more office romances since the confines of the office have changed. They're much more fluid. Everybody's working from home or from wherever they can get Wi-Fi that's safe. And so you're not going out for a drink on Friday necessarily with your department, but you might be meeting for coffee at a local place with a colleague. Furthermore, we make jokes about, you know, stray dogs, cats, or kids wandering live into a Zoom shot when you're on Zoom. But can you imagine how much more startling it might be if Amanda from accounting walks through the back of Jack from shipping's Zoom shot, and Amanda's clearly rocking Jack's 1990s concert t-shirt and a cup of coffee? That'll put a damper on the Zoom. Or let's say it's Jack from shipping and Claire, the most valuable customer. So anyway, some relationships between coworkers should be encouraged to serve the interests of the business, as clear, open, and respectful dialogue are all hallmarks of an efficient and successful business. Those, though, are not the type of relationships that involve long, intimate dinners for two. Rather, they're the Zooms where the whole team gets together virtually. They support each other, they celebrate a work victory together. No employer wants to be the love police, but there's significant risk to exposure, damage to reputation, loss of productivity. All of this can happen if it's a poorly managed, tolerated, or ill-conceived office romance. So we hope to impart to you some tools that will help you manage your office environment and avoid costly litigation arising out of any office romance. Next slide, please.
So it's the unique aspects of the workplace that make workplace romances both interesting and a little bit taboo, and also exacerbate some of those legal risks and concerns associated with them. And one of those unique factors is the power imbalance that's often involved. With workplace romances, employers are often dealing with supervisors and subordinates in relationship. The situations don't necessarily always involve participants that are on the same level in the organization or same playing field, so to speak. In the outside world, it's of course common for relationships to involve people in different positions or in different financial states or social standings. But in the workplace, those differences are really exacerbated and can have a far more direct impact on the individuals involved, especially when one person carries a far greater power within the organization and even potentially power over the other participants' employment and livelihood. So for example, how does a power imbalance impact an individual's ability to consent to requests by their partner? This could apply both to work-related tasks and non-work-related issues that could become work-related, as we'll talk about today. But let's say we have a manager and employee in a romantic relationship, and the manager asks the employee to engage in some less than ethical activity at work. Maybe the employee would ordinarily say no, but there's a possibility that the employee could feel pressured to engage in that activity because it's their romantic partner asking them to do it. They also might fear that failure to do so could impact the relationship, or their employment could be at risk if they decline. Again, a risk that ordinarily wouldn't be there, but for the romance. The type of pressure like this could also extend to more private activities and intimate aspects of the relationship. For example, an employee could feel pressured to engage in sexual activity or consent to sexual forthcomings by the other person, because it's not just their partner asking them, but it's also their manager at work. And so this could lead to a fear of reprisal at work if they don't engage or consent to the activity. And this could lead to, of course, not only relationship problems, but more the employer's issue is going to be the potential harassment claims and problems that could become issues later on if the behavior continues and is not addressed. Another issue relates to when affection between employees isn't reciprocated. The hope is that employees at all levels are working together collaboratively and have developed collegial relationships with one another. But when employees work together in that type of environment for long hours sometimes, it's certainly understandable that feelings can arise. As Beth was mentioning, with COVID restricting outside activity, people are getting a lot of their social interaction in the workplace most times, just because there's been less opportunity to go out and meet people organically in public places. The problem is that when—
Liz, could I jump in for a second?
Yeah, of course.
One of the things that's tricky that comes up in this situation is when, particularly in light of COVID, when you have an employee that has unreciprocated feelings and they're going to the object of romance's home, and yet you as the human resource manager somehow has to manage that. We all kind of remember there was a large retailer in Maine that had a situation where an employee who had a crush on another employee was not only going to that employee's workspace, but also going to their home. And the suggestion I think Liz and I would have is to work collaboratively with the impacted employee and bring in outside forces if necessary, meaning it may become necessary to involve law officials if it's escalating to a point where there may be safety issues. So we want you to think about things not just in the office environment, but a little bit outside as well. And certainly don't hesitate to ask for guidance if a situation like that comes up, because it is hard to tell what is the scale of risk. And you sure don't want to say, oh, it's not a big risk, and only to find out that in fact, it was a big risk. Go ahead, Liz, sorry.
No, definitely. That's a great point, Beth. And, you know, in addition to those risks, you know, going back to, that's sort of definitely one end of the spectrum is, you know, potential issues that might involve law enforcement. We'll talk about workplace violence later in the presentation. But even the, the smaller impacts of unrequited love, so to speak, creating tension and really uncomfortable situations in the workplace, particularly if someone doesn't understand that their feelings aren't being reciprocated, can cause a really uncomfortable environment for those involved in the relationship or lack thereof, as well as those who have to witness the tension and the uncomfortableness. Think about how Zoom meetings will go and how various, projects where you have teams involved might be impacted by those situations. And so even if you have people who are involved in a seemingly positive relationship, those relationships can end badly. And that can cause tension in the workplace, but also it could affect the bottom line as well for your organization. You can imagine a situation where, say, you have two people who are involved in a relationship and they're in their sales department, they're prepping a big client pitch, and they happen to break up and have a terrible argument the day before. The hope would be that everybody could hold it together, but that could potentially cause a lot of tension and strain that could impact your organization's ability to pitch that client on short notice. So there's always those risks involved as well. Beth mentioned the home relationship, or going to employees' homes. There's also the impact on potential personal relationships of your employees. According to a survey done by vault.com a few years ago, 46% of employees knew a married colleague who engaged in a workplace affair. So while we're talking about work, employees being involved with each other in the workplace, those home relationships, personal relationships could also be affected, and that could, impact the employee's work at the organization, as well as potentially, on the more serious side, cause workplace violence issues later on. Technology is another element of the workplace that can really exacerbate these issues. Text messages, emails, social networking, and other types of technological communication make office flirting easier than ever, and much easier than it would be in person. And because tone and body language can't really be conveyed over these types of communications, there's more of a risk that flirting could cause offense and misunderstanding among employees. And that means potential legal exposure for a sexual harassment claim. This type of thing is actually so prevalent. There's been a terminology developed for it. It's called textual harassment. So you can kind of see the play on words there. Another thing to consider is that technology creates a very convenient stored written record of all of the potentially inappropriate conduct. So emails and chats can exist indefinitely depending on your system's capabilities. And so problematic communications, like explicit emails or communications, can be traced and make it easier for a plaintiff later on to make a claim of harassment and prove it if the conduct involved online conduct. Similarly, PDA can also be an issue. I think it goes without saying that many coworkers might be uncomfortable with seeing their other coworkers engage in intimate conduct in the workplace. But again, those types of interactions can be really can make it very difficult to address a claim of sexual harassment if it's later claimed that those advances were unwanted. Next slide, please. Yeah.
Liz, we've had a question come in, if it's okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So the question is, what is your opinion about a person who adopts the so-called, quotes, Mike Pence policy, which is to avoid situations that could give rise to temptation or set the stage for a false harassment allegation, and those do occur. Such situations include spending time alone, such as travel alone together. Candidly, attendee, we're going to get to a couple of those policies that we can put into place. And it really depends on the employer's risk aversion, but there is something I'm going to speak about later called a love contract that you can employ. Depending on your scale of risk aversion, it may make sense to avoid any such situation, such as traveling together, gender versus gender, or whatever might give rise to the relationship. I think it is very difficult to have a blanket policy, and Liz, you can agree with me, that can be accurately policed, because the honest truth is people will be people. But hopefully, as we go through this presentation, you'll pick up pointers that will enable you to craft the policy that you will roll out to your employees that will allow you to have the tools to conduct an appropriate investigation if necessary and impose appropriate discipline, again, if necessary, that will be in concert with the policy that you believe fits your employment environment. Liz, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, well said, Beth. I agree.
Okay, back to me. So who can bring claims? Everybody. That's the answer. So anybody, honestly, who can make out the legal basis for a claim, depending on what the claim is. So it could be a coworker who makes a claim for either retaliation for reporting a relationship that was prohibited by policy, discrimination because maybe they reported a policy or they were retaliated against because they reported a policy and they didn't get a promotion they wanted. Direct report to a supervisor, that oftentimes happens. A supervisor or manager could make the same claim. And one of the things that we don't want you to miss is that a vendor or a valued client could also make such a claim. Here, for example, there's a big claims meeting, say, where it's a seminar where you bring together all of your clients, and there's a cocktail party aspect to that event. And it happens every year, and everybody looks forward to it because you get to speak with each other. Vendors are there, clients are there, and then something untoward happens, and a client is offended, and a client reports, Captain McKenzie, when he was dancing with me, made me very uncomfortable. That can happen, and it's got to be addressed immediately. We're also, I want to point out, everybody is aware, particularly in the post-Me Too era, of very high profile workplace affairs that did not end well for the participants. I'm going to mention one in particular that's been in the news a little later in the presentation. But for now, let's just say pretty much anyone, as long as they can make out the elements of the claim, can bring a claim. May we have the next slide, please? So I want to just point out now, we're getting into the meat of the laws that may apply, just so that you know generally what the landscape is. First of all, we have the federal Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a vintage year, if I may say so. So under the Civil Rights Act, it prohibits unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal and physical conduct of a sexual nature that explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment. So it's going to have an impact on the individual's employment, but that can be shown in a number of ways, as we'll see. This particular law applies to employers with 15 or more employees, and the acts can rise to the level of sexual harassment when they unreasonably interfere with the individual's work performance or create a hostile work environment. So state laws also prohibit sexual harassment, discrimination, unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal and physical conduct of a sexual nature. Again, that would follow and track the Title VII description that would explicitly or implicitly affect an individual's employment and generally follow the same guidance. As well, just be aware, some state law allows for individual liability, say Massachusetts, or accomplice liability, which means if the employer is aware or should be aware, or it looks like they were aware and yet they let it continue, they may be liable as under a theory of almost as an accomplice. So there are two, yes, and I listed here, I'm sorry, the other laws, you can see those in the materials, but they're pretty obvious. Retaliation, hostile work environment. Constructive discharge is a harder one to prove because there are subjective elements to that. But if it's truly a horrendous situation, constructive discharge means you just absolutely were sick to your stomach and could not go to work. It was so awful. Reputational damage usually comes up in the context of someone accused of sexual harassment. And when the investigation is completed, there was no sexual harassment. And yet the problem is the minute that accusation is made, the reputation is in trouble. Then, of course, intentional infliction of emotional distress, that could be the jilted lover. That could also be coworkers who have to hang around when there's awful PDA. You just have to make the elements of the claim. And then I've noted that sexual harassment can also be a workers' compensation claim. We'll talk about that a little later. It depends very much on the standard. Almost every single workers' compensation law has an arising out of and in the course of nexus for the workplace piece of it, but it depends on whether it's accidental injury, bodily injury, personal injury, and different workers' compensation laws in different states use different language. So it will turn on the analysis of that language. I'm sorry, now if we could advance. So there are two types specifically of sexual harassment. The first one is quid pro quo. Quid, which is Latin, you do this for me and I'll do that for you, is the basic translation. Although I think my Latin teacher would roll over if he heard me say that. But anyway, it exists when a supervisor seeks sexual favors in exchange for an employment benefit to a subordinate employee. The employment benefit can take virtually any form, but most often it's the promise of a promotion or preferred job duties or anything along the lines, maybe a better shift, maybe access to the better clients or the higher income revenue stream. And it can also exist, frankly, in the context of you can keep a job if you do this for me sexually. That it can be that basic, honestly. Employers, by the way, are strictly liable under the quid pro quo theory, but the employee who's impacted must show that it was unwanted, unwelcome. Where it gets tricky is where they may not, the impacted victim, for lack of a better word, may not have manifested that for fear of not getting the employee benefit. So as we talk about it a little more, that you'll see the standards that have to be met, but that can be difficult to show also because it's most often a he said, she said, a he said, or a she said, she said. There very rarely are witnesses to quid pro quo because obviously it's on the down low. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. You know, you don't usually do that in a public place. Hostile work environment sexual harassment is based on gender or sex generally. So it's generally a protected class. And it's got to be so severe and pervasive as to alter the conditions of employment. So here are the basic bullet points that you need to know. You need to show that he or she was a member of a protected class, that the behavior was unwelcome, that the harassment was based on that protected class, the sex/gender, that the harassment was sufficiently severe or pervasive so as to alter the conditions of employment and create an abusive work environment, that the sexual conduct was both objectively and subjectively offensive, such that a reasonable person would find it to be hostile or abusive, and the victim/recipient did in fact find it to be so. And then finally, there has to be some basis for employer liability, such as we reported it, they did nothing, everybody was aware of it, there was a culture of this kind of behavior. There is possibly a defense that Liz will talk about a little more thoroughly, known as the Farragut-Ellerth defense to hostile work environment. And that is basically that once the employer is made aware of the harassment, if they take steps to investigate and remedy promptly the situation, they may enjoy a defense to the claim. So for that reason, investigation should be taken on seriously, promptly, as soon as you hear of such a type of sexual harassment or assault. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to run through just a quick example here. So Alice is hired as a director. This is quid pro quo harassment. Alice is hired as a direct report to supervisor Sam. Sam's considered the top producer in the company and can basically do whatever he wants, or so he thinks. At first, their interaction is professional. And although Alice is thrilled when Sam starts to take a real interest in her growth and promotion within the company, she's excited. She thinks this is great. Soon though, however, Sam's asking Alice to come into his office, close the door, and he starts to talk about personal things that seem to have nothing to do with work. And frankly, they make Alice a bit uncomfortable. But Alice goes along because she values her relationship with Sam. Sam escalates to an invitation on a late Friday night after a long week of work to get a drink together to celebrate a particularly profitable week. Alice feels uneasy, but the unspoken implication is to reject the offer is to potentially lose her sponsor, her insider track on promotion within the company. Alice goes for the drink with Sam, and soon Sam is making romantic moves on Alice. Alice doesn't object because she's afraid to lose her sponsor and her position, but she does feel kind of sick about it because she doesn't want that type of attention from Sam. She wants to be viewed as a valued professional colleague. The pattern begins to repeat itself every week, and it escalates over time until it is clear that if Alice objects, her professional future is at stake. Can I have the next slide? Here's an example of hostile work environment sexual harassment claim. So Jason is a handsome up-and-comer in the nonprofit world. He's hired to his first senior position as a development officer at a big nonprofit. He's going to report to the executive director, Madison. On his first day, as Jason is setting up his office, Madison walks by the door, backs up, and says something to Jason along the lines of how great he looks in his slim-fit J. Crew dress shirt. Jason is uncomfortable, and he asks Madison to just keep things on a professional topic when in the office. Madison shrugs, smirks, and walks on. The behavior continues and begins to escalate, always comments on Jason's looks or outfit, but rarely feedback on how Jason is performing in his job or comments on the success that Jason is getting with getting new donors or new funding. Madison has even made these comments at potential donor meetings, making everyone uncomfortable. Eventually, Jason asks to speak with the board chair, reports what's been going on, and explains how difficult it is, and it's making his job really hard and him very uncomfortable. A confidential investigation begins, but it's also review time for Jason. Madison is in charge of the review, and the board allows Madison to complete it, and Jason gets a poor review. Meanwhile, Madison has hired a new development officer, Oliver, and Jason is told he'll be assistant development officer. So I want you all to think about those, and we can talk about them at the end if you'd like. Next slide, please.
So in addition to the claims that could be brought by those directly involved in or who are party to a relationship, there can also be legal liability to third parties, as Beth had alluded to a few slides ago. And third parties would be those that aren't directly involved in the relationship. So Beth also talked about what a hostile work environment is. And the fact is that that is very, very commonly a potential claim that could be applicable to a third party who's not involved in the romance. If they're subjected to behavior that nonetheless rises to that level of severity and pervasiveness to create a hostile work environment as a product of the relationships or romance occurring in the workplace. Another basis for liability relates to what's called favoritism, which is, of course, showing a preference to certain individuals in the workplace. Now, as a bit of a caveat, not all favoritism in the workplace is necessarily bad or going to result in legal liability. It's, of course, one thing to give preferential treatment to an employee because they're a top performer or because they're extremely dedicated to the job or so on. But when the favoritism arises from the existence of a romantic relationship or romantic or intimate preferences, that's where things start to get complicated and a little bit murky. And when it's really important to think about the impact of that favoritism on others who aren't necessarily involved in the relationship. So the EEOC addresses third-party sexual favoritism in its policy guidance related to Title VII. And it's actually identified 3 distinct categories of favoritism: isolated, coerced, and widespread favoritism. So I wanted to just briefly touch on what those are and how those can create liability for sexual harassment. So let's say we have a manager who's involved in a relationship with a single employee, and that single employee is given preferential treatment over others at the facility. Better shifts, better assignments, better projects, whatever is applicable to your situation. Is there a claim for everybody else who is disadvantaged by that favoritism? Not necessarily, actually. So the courts have actually held that favoritism toward a single love interest, or a paramour, as they term it sometimes, is not necessarily unlawful under Title VII because it doesn't rise to the level of creating that gender or a general gender or sex discrimination or harassment. The logic is that, you know, a manager is acting with favoritism towards somebody because they're the love interest and everybody else is disadvantaged, not because they're male or female, but because they are on the outside of the relationship. So they're, you know, the status would be not being in the relationship, which isn't necessarily a protected class. Along those lines, courts have also rejected claims of retaliation made by people who complain about that type of favoritism. Again, because Title VII does prohibit retaliation for complaining about unlawful discrimination and sexual harassment, but because those isolated or paramour favoritism situations aren't illegal, retaliation can't apply for making complaints about that type of behavior. Coerced or widespread favoritism is different though. So unlike favoritism for a single individual, favoritism that's exercised with a coercion or on a widespread basis can create claims under Title VII. So if an employee becomes a favored love interest because they submitted to sexual requests or coercion, other employees of the same gender who were not, maybe they weren't asked to submit to that activity or they declined to, they could create or they could allege sexual harassment based on their declining to engage in that type of behavior. And that again applies even if those persons weren't asked to submit to that behavior. The fact that that type of behavior led to advancement for another person can result in a type of claim for quid pro quo harassment. Similarly, there's also case law to support the idea that if a manager sends a message in the workplace that sexual favors or consent to that type of behavior is an unspoken job requirement. Even if those favors aren't being asked of individuals or third parties, those other people can allege that the supervisor regards members of a specific gender as quote, sexual playthings. That's actually the EEOC's language, not mine. But under that theory, sexual harassment liability can attach because the manager is creating this demeaning atmosphere toward a specific gender, and that's a basis for a harassment claim. Retaliation can also be a basis for a third-party claim. As you all know, it's illegal to retaliate against somebody for their declining to participate in illegal activity or engaging in protected activity like making a complaint about harassment. But the US Supreme Court has actually recognized that it's an adverse employment action against an employee to take adverse action against like a spouse or a fiance of that employee because it goes back to the fact that Title VII's anti-retaliation provisions are designed to prevent employers from taking actions that might have a chilling effect on reports or might dissuade a reasonable worker from making a report of illegal activity. And so because taking a negative action against that person's love interest or partner could impact whether somebody comes forward, that could be a basis for a retaliation claim. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some other considerations outside of legal liability, just again, touching on some risks. Damage to employee morale and productivity. We've talked about this quite a bit, but I don't want to spend too much time, but it does bear repeating. Things like employee speculation and gossip about others in the workplace involved in romances can really distract from business operations, business goals, and there's a risk that you can alienate and anger employees who aren't involved in those relationships if they feel like decisions are being made because of involvement in a workplace relationship rather than based on their personal merit or hard work in the organization. The result of this type of discontent can also lead to higher turnover rates, both for employees who are witnessing the relationship and also those who are involved in the relationship. Even for those who are involved who may seem to be in a positive relationship, people still perceive that being in a relationship is damaging to the potential career of those involved. There's a Vault survey from a couple years ago that showed that 13% of employees who were themselves involved in an office romance had a negative or perceived it as having a negative impact on a colleague's career. So that would be their partner's career. And 12% of the employees involved in the office romance thought that it actually negatively impacted their own career. So this perception that romance impacts an employee's ability to move forward in an organization is definitely cause for concern, especially if we're, have high performers involved or people in high roles in the organization, if they're at risk of leaving. Then, of course, as Beth mentioned, negative publicity can be another issue, particularly when you have situations that might be adulterous or involve high-profile individuals, whether it be employees or clients or the company itself. That can really easily attract unwanted media attention if things go south. Court records are not private. So if a lawsuit is filed, there's potential that it's discoverable by other parties who are not involved. And news spreads lightning fast with the internet and social media these days, as I'm sure you all know. Couple that with the fact that we have documentation of things, of communications over technology, and that can lead to a really sour situation. Lastly, and relatedly, conflicts of interest and other ethics problems. Again, if you have people involved in different power levels in the organization who are making decisions about their love interests, compensation or responsibilities or advancement, that can create really difficult situations ethically that might also violate your internal ethical standards in addition to outside professional standards that might apply. And it's also worth considering that in 2018, a survey revealed that 43% of people thought romantic relationships between colleagues at different levels in the company are unacceptable. And that was the highest proportion that surveyor had ever discovered, and it's been increasing over the years. So general discontent and disapproval of those types of relationships is on the rise. Next slide, please. So I want to look at a brief hypothetical to sort of demonstrate how the third party claims come about. So let's say we have Manager John and Manager Joan are in a relationship at work. They've been dating for a few months now, and it appears that they're both happy in the relationship. Joan, however, regularly shares details about her relationship with John with employees Aaron and Emma. And Joan actually used to work at the same level at the company as Aaron and Emma until she got promoted. So the three are pretty comfortable with each other and know each other pretty well. So for that reason, Joan feels pretty comfortable sharing rather intimate details about her relationship, sometimes X-rated details about her relationship with John. She also sometimes takes digs at Aaron and Emma for still being single and offers to set them up with John's friends and other employees at the company. So Emma doesn't really seem to mind the conversation, and she participates and laughs along with Joan, but Aaron has been very uncomfortable hearing these details about John, and she feels really bad and awkward when Joan's making negative comments about her own dating life. Aaron has never actually told this to Joan, but she did let another manager know, she's close with this other manager, that these discussions are making her uncomfortable. A few weeks later, Aaron and Emma both apply for a manager role, and Emma gets the promotion, but Aaron does not. So the question is, what are some of the risks involved in this situation, or some of the claims that we should potentially be aware of? And next slide. So I know it's a little small, I hope you all can read it, but the first thing to think about is that hostile work environment claim. Depending on the frequency and the intensity of Joan's comments, especially those more X-rated ones, that could possibly rise to a level of severity and pervasiveness where that could be considered to create a hostile work environment. Thinking about Erin, if she knows that every time she sees Joan, she's going to be inundated with these details about Joan and John, in particular the intimate ones, and also made to feel poorly about herself and inadequate by the comments about her being single and offering to set her up with other colleagues, that could create a really uncomfortable work environment that could affect Erin's productivity and the general work environment for her. One element that Erin would need to show, of course, is that she's subjected to this because of a protected trait, in this case, likely her sex or gender. But given the scope of the comments and the relationship at issue, that might not be an unreasonable hurdle for her to meet. Again, more information is needed, but there's definitely a risk there. It's also important to remember that hostile work environment can exist between members of the same sex, even when it appears that everything's okay and everything's welcome. It's based on
Liz, I may steal this after you're done, if you don't mind.
Sure. No, it's, hostile work environments based not only on the objectiveness of the activity, but the subjective experience of the person witnessing the activity. So even though Emma appears to be laughing along and participating, she might actually feel very uncomfortable and still have a claim as well. Another issue is going to be whether Aaron could be considered a whistleblower. So under Maine law, protected activity can involve a report of illegal activity or what a person believes is illegal activity. So, there's a few outstanding questions here. We need to think about what it is that Aaron reported. Reporting that Joan and John are intersexual relationship to that other manager, that might not be protected activity because being in the relationship isn't necessarily illegal. But if Aaron was reporting that she felt she was being sexually harassed and that she was uncomfortable, and that, that more of the content of what was going on, that could be perceived as a report of a violation of the law because sexual harassment is illegal. We also know that, while Aaron told a manager about the behavior, we need to consider sort of the context in which she did so. If she was reporting to the manager as a friend or just kind of griping about the issue rather than making a more formal report aimed at stopping the behavior, that could also impact whether she's entitled to protection under the whistleblower statute. And lastly, retaliation. So thinking about that promotion, we know that Aaron really hadn't participated in the discussions with Joan, and we know that she didn't get the promotion, whereas Emma, who did participate, did get the promotion. And on the facts they've given you, it's really difficult to tell if retaliation occurred here. To fully assess whether there was retaliatory intent in the promotion, we really need more information. We need to know who made the decision about who gets the promotion, what that decision maker knew or didn't know about both Joan's relationship and the behavior that was going on with Aaron. If the manager that Aaron reported to never told anybody else about Aaron's feelings and was not involved in the decision making, then it might be a clearer case that that wasn't retaliation for participating. But again, we don't know if Joan sensed that there was any discomfort from Aaron or if Joan was a decision maker. We also don't know the objective factors that went into the promotional decision. And this is one reason why it can be so important to have good performance reviews and good records of employee qualifications and documenting the reasons for giving promotions that are made on an objective basis, is that if we have those well-documented objective reasons, then that can be really great support for showing that there was no retaliation for engaging in any protected activity or opposing the behavior.
So before we move on, let's go back to the example I gave, if you don't mind, with Jason and Madison. If we were in a live place, I'd be asking you guys these questions, but I'm going to have to just say it to you because we're doing it on Zoom. But using the similar analysis to what Liz has done, Jason might be able to perhaps make out a hostile work environment claim, given the pervasiveness that we described of Madison, always only commenting on his appearance and never commenting on his professional achievements. Again, it's a fact finder's decision on whether that's true or not, but we might have the elements that we recited earlier as far as being part of a class, the behavior targeted at him, the question of whether it was unwelcome. He pretty much made it clear day one it was unwelcome. Whether an objective observer would say it was both, subjectively and objectively offensive. I mean, it is very offensive when you're trying to do a good job and all anybody does is, gee, I like your slim fit J. Crew shirt, So potentially Jason might be able to make out a claim of hostile work environment. Similarly to Liz's analysis, is it possible he could make out a whistleblower claim? Maybe. How about that donor who was in the donor meeting when Madison was making completely inappropriate comments? Could that person potentially say, I felt sexually harassed by Madison? Maybe. And then finally, if you recall, poor Jason gets a bad review because though the board did the right thing and began an investigation, they did the wrong thing by allowing Madison to conduct Jason's review. So that was a big mistake. Can that mistake be fixed? Can you correct the review? Can you redo the review? Those are questions the board would be doing in an attempt to forestall a claim of retaliation or hostile work environment from Jason. Additionally, can we fix that demotion? Because as I mentioned, Madison not only gave Jason a bad review, but he brought in Oliver and gave Oliver Jason's job. Now that's a little trickier. That would involve some serious discussions and would involve perhaps the entire board of directors plus legal counsel. I'm not sure you could fix that, but that would be a question that would be on the table for the board to consider. And finally, what do we do with Madison? I mean, obviously we've got a problem here. Not only do we have a problem internally, but as I mentioned, it's a nonprofit. You're not going to have donors if it gets out that the executive director is a predator. So something has to be done abruptly with Madison. And again, that would be something in discussion with council. Do we pay a severance and ask Madison to go gently into that quiet night? Does it still get out into the community? How do we show that we've acted proactively? These are all the questions you're going to be needing to answer should a situation like this come up in that example that I provided you with Jason, Madison, and Oliver. We'll come back, if you don't mind, to the other example at the end of our discussion that I gave you, because that's a little trickier, and I think it merits just a few minutes at the end of our discussion. So next slide, please. So if we haven't scared you enough at this point about legal liability, let's just hit you with a few more. So God forbid, some type of violence, whether it be sexual harassment, sexual assault, or even some other type of violence erupts in the workplace, growing out of a workplace romance or relationship gone wrong. These are the things you need to be thinking about that could be causes of action that could come after you. So a claim of negligent hiring. Under that theory, an employer might be liable for failing to appropriately screen employees, resulting in harm to other employees or vendors or clients by the employee if that employee has either a violent, criminal, or predator type history or any other unsavory history that could or should have been uncovered by routine reference checks and prior employment checks. So one of the most important things that jumps out to me when in my interactions with clients is oftentimes I find incomplete employment applications where there's only the most recent employer listed and the reason for leaving is kind of like, maybe I filled it in, maybe I didn't. That's not acceptable. You need a completed employment application. You need to be able to check references. So if somebody hands in an application like that, your choice is either to give it back and say, could you complete these sections, please? Or that goes into the discard pile. It really ought not get into the I hired you pile. Next is negligent supervision. Under that theory, an employer might be liable for failing to provide just what it says, adequate supervision to an employee, which results in harm to others. That one's a little harder to make out the cause of action. It has to be pretty clear that there was some indication that this particular employee required some supervision and that there was an absolute void or absence of supervision, but it does exist as a potential claim. Next, how about negligent retention? That's when we have a manager who's got a history perhaps, or an employee who's got a history of inappropriate or violent behavior towards others. Maybe he's a screamer and you know that he has a tendency to scream right in the face of other employees, or maybe he's got the history of having relationships and he's never been fired or terminated or adequately reprimanded. So somebody could bring a claim that there was a risk of harm to others or employees. There was in fact harm to others employees because we retained this unsavory or unacceptable employee. Now we're moving into more of, sort of the world of safety on a very safety level. So under OSHA has this general duty clause, which requires all employers to maintain a safe work environment. Additionally, every couple of years, OSHA updates a specific sexual harassment safety policy, which can be found on their website. I believe the most recent one, it's a little old, it's from 2017, but it's not a bad idea to take a look at it periodically, particularly share it perhaps with your health, safety, and environment person if you have one of those in your organization. At a minimum, it should be maybe viewed by the safety committee and by HR on a regular basis. But basically, if one employee acts violently, threatens, intimidates, or intentionally harms another, that might be an OSHA violation. OSHA has directives, as I said, on investigating and addressing that, and you certainly don't want to be on the wrong side of one of those investigations. They also identify, interestingly, types of work that are higher risk. So if you are in a category such as that, it would behoove you to check out the policy to make sure you're meeting the minimum requirements. Things that are included in those that higher risk category include things like predictably bartending, working overnight shifts, perhaps in a remote location, taxi Uber driver types, you're driving people, people who have to exchange money with the public, particularly people who exchange money with the public, perhaps in an overnight or a more remote area. So if that's your industry, I would train your people on how to spot and address the issues and make sure you have a robust safety policy in place. Excuse me a minute. I have to cough. I'm sorry, folks. Muted myself after I coughed. Sorry about that. Finally, we just before we move on to this, I just want to talk really quickly about the Workers' Compensation Act, because this doesn't always occur to people. Depending on the jurisdiction, workplace violence, to include sexual harassment or assault, might fall under the state workers' compensation law. So in Maine, if the violence arises out of employment, meaning that it results from workplace tension or some other relationship that's uniquely part of the work, and it happens during employment, meaning it arises in the course of employment, meaning it happens at a location or a time or a place when an employee should be working and the employer expects them to be working, it might result in what's in a workers' compensation injury. The term in many different jurisdictions, it's going to depend, again, as I mentioned earlier, if it's a personal injury, an accidental injury. In Maine, again, it's considered a personal injury. So generally, the courts have looked to whether there was some sort of personal, meaning co-worker relationship. There's some interesting case law. In one case, there were two meat cutters, one of whom had the job of washing up the room walls in which they cut meat. The other one was cutting meat with his friend or his colleague and decided to be super funny to throw a slab of meat at the wall. And of course, as you can imagine, that made the guy who had to clean the room up mad. He was holding a boning knife in his hand. He hit his coworker in the back of the head with a slab of meat. When the coworker turned, he stabbed him with the boning knife. And that was found to be a work-related assault because all of it arose out of the context of the work they were performing. You can't make these facts patterns up. They're really awesome. There's another one where a poor fellow was just trying to walk to his machine and a colleague decided it would be really funny to choke him and try to make him fall on the floor. The man fell, he broke a kneecap. And because the personal relationship existed, the court found that that was also an assault arising out of employment. What's important there is workers' compensation. If you pay for your workers' compensation insurer, generally in every jurisdiction, you enjoy what's known as exclusivity. What that means is the only causes of action, the only remedies available to that injured employee are those available under the Workers' Compensation Act, which generally include wage replacement, payment of medical bills. That's pretty much it. Having said that, most jurisdictions, many jurisdictions that do find that workers' compensation applies also permit non-pecuniary damages outside of the workers' compensation forum. In Maine, what that means is damage to reputation, interference with economic advantage relationships. Those are the big ones that might be brought, negligence, infliction of emotional distress. Those perhaps can be brought in a court of law and would not be subject to the exclusivity provision because they're not remedies available to the injured worker under the Workers' Compensation Act, and yet they may move outside of that act, and there may be benefits or damages available for those types of claims. In other jurisdictions, they simply don't recognize assault, sexual harassment as a work-related injury because it's not an accident, usually. It's usually intentional, and or it's not an injury necessarily. So it's just critically important that an employer thoroughly investigate the fact pattern, thoroughly prepare, and also coordinate with any other, say, general liability insurer or whatever insurer might perhaps be called upon should a claim be advanced? Typically, under most workers' compensation contracts, intentional behavior is excluded. So it may be possible that even though the physical results or even the mental stress are covered by the workers' compensation law or insurance, there may be other claims that, because they are intentional, may be moved out, and it may be you as the employer who have to pay those damages and those defenses. So just keep that in mind. All right, maybe we move on, please.
All right, so I recognize we're going to go a little over time here. If you do have to jump off, just thank you for joining us, and please keep an eye out for the recorded presentation, which I mentioned will be sent to you. So keep an eye out for that. But we'll dive into best practices here quickly for a few minutes. The first that you'll hear at just about every presentation I think I give is drafting appropriate and realistic policies for your workplace. This is really step one, I think, for addressing workplace romance and relationship issues, starting with your harassment policies. Anti-harassment, anti-discrimination, anti-retaliation policies are a great place to start. Make sure they're up to date and reflect your current practices. If you have a policy that references, reports should be made to so-and-so left the organization 5 years ago, then it's not going to necessarily be helpful for an employee to turn to that policy and figure out what to do if they feel that they need to make a report of sexual harassment. One element to consider is that states are more and more frequently requiring that there be specific elements in your sexual harassment policies. In Maine, for example, a sexual harassment policy has to reference the communication or the contact information for the Maine Human Rights Commission. Most states that have requirements will require that you state that sexual harassment is illegal. So keep in mind that you should check your state law as to what specific requirements are for your policy and whether you're required to have one in the first place. IT and social media policies are another place for attention. We talked about earlier the impact that communications made over work technology systems can have, and that those are memorialized. You might consider restricting people from using workplace technology to communicate personal issues and having personal chats over. You might consider monitoring employee communications. If you do, then we recommend you let employees know that there's no expectation of privacy in workplace communications. Social media is another big one. Even if you restrict the use of social media at work, keep in mind that employees will still connect with each other potentially over social media outside of work. And those communications can be the basis for a workplace harassment claim, even if they're not work-related, not condoned, they can still impact those types of claims. Romance policies, these are the types of policies that we hear about in the news that are related to whether you're going to permit people to engage in workplace romances, what those should look like, what reports need to be made, and so on. I'm going to defer to Beth on that. She'll touch a little bit more on those in the next slide. But for any of your policies, making sure that you're addressing both conduct and reporting by employees and supervisors and any differences in those responsibilities is really important, as well as making sure that those policies are available to everybody for viewing and access. Perhaps most importantly, though, is applying them uniformly and really thinking about what the penalties are going to be for violations of your policies. If you don't already have policies in place, look at your past penalties that you've imposed for violations of the applicable behavior as sort of a starting point, because past behavior sets precedent for future behavior, which is a great reason to have a policy, is to set those expectations to make sure that you're treating people uniformly. But that's a great place to start if you don't already have something in place. Next slide, please. Next is going to be conducting regular trainings. This is another best practice to avoid issues associated with workplace romances. The reason that you want to engage in sexual harassment training is twofold. First, it can help you avoid and defend against legal claims. Beth mentioned the Farragut-Ellerth defense. One element of that defense to a sexual harassment claim is that the employer exercised reasonable care to prevent sexually harassing behavior. Having training in place for your employees, managers, and supervisors is a key element in showing that you exercise that reasonable care to prevent the harassing behavior from occurring. When you are engaging in sexual harassment training, or if you're deciding whether to engage in it, keep in mind that there are state requirements for sexual harassment trainings. It's a little beyond the scope of this presentation, but Maine does have a requirement for sexual harassment training for workplaces with 15 or more employees. Connecticut has training requirements for all employers, but they're different depending on if you have more or less than 3 employees. Massachusetts is a strong encouragement, and New Hampshire actually doesn't have a requirement. But keep in mind, if you do have a requirement, there's often going to also be requirements for the content of the training as well. So again, it's really important to understand your obligations under state law. Next slide, please.
So very quickly, because I appreciate your time. First of all, it's important to have a policy barring relationships between a supervisor and a direct report or spouses if both are employed at the company, if that meets your risk tolerance. I think it makes some common sense, but again, it's up to your environment, your workplace, your risk tolerance. Ideally, the policy would bar all romantic relationships in the workplace as detrimental to the overall cohesion and function of the workplace, but again, up to you. I mentioned these love contracts. This is a new emerging area. I'm not super keen on them, I'm going to be honest with you, but going back to the question that was asked very early in the presentation, where a company becomes aware of a consensual relationship between employees who are not supervisor, supervisee, or direct reports, people have used this thing called a love contract. It's usually used for, say, C-suite or very high-level employees, not low-level management, supervisor, employee, none of that usually. Basically, it's a signed agreement where the 2 parties in the relationship agree that the relationship is consensual, and that needs to be done separately, even though they're the same level. You want to take one and then the other and make sure each agrees it's consensual. Doesn't involve any harassment. They also agree to behave professionally in the office and to follow the reporting procedures. That's important. Some of you remember just recently, maybe 2 weeks ago, Jeff Zucker was required to resign from CNN because despite the fact that he was having a consensual relationship, he had failed to report it. Bad optics, he was forced to resign. Then finally, contractual issues. You may all know that presently there's a bill that if President Biden signs it into law, will eliminate the ability to use contractual arbitration for sexual harassment claims. That really only will directly impact federal contractors because most employers are at-will employers, but it's an important point to know. Additionally, settlement and separation agreements, there's been a movement that to eliminate the ability to use non-disparagement or non-disclosure provisions, a movement to eliminate the ability for a private employer to use liquidated damages. Both of those are disincentives, as you can imagine, for employers to settle those smaller, dubious, we could spend a lot of money on defense and we might lose, so let's just settle. Without non-disparagement, non-disclosure, liquidated damages, it's going to be harder to convince your higher levels that this is a good idea to settle or to have a separation agreement with this particular employee. Typically in workers' compensation context, there's a side agreement if you truly want to eliminate all general employment law claims because the administrative law judge in every context in workers' comp only has jurisdiction over the work-related injury. Many, many jurisdictions include a full release of all claims arising out of employment, but typically those are not binding absent side, it's called consideration. So side money and the side consideration and side agreement, the consideration should be on a level with the risk involved with the release of the claims. Next slide, please.
All right, this is our last slide of the day, but it is an important one, and it relates to investigating harassment allegations. So first things first, if you get an employee or a manager or somebody reporting sexual harassment, you should investigate it. Failure to investigate it either externally or by having an external investigator can be really detrimental to a legal defense. It's also, if an investigation isn't done, then there's potentially really serious problems going on that aren't being remedied that should be, and that can result in additional problems. The other aspect of investigations is that they provide an opportunity for remedial action and corrective opportunities for the harassment. And that, again, is one element of the Farragher-Ellerth defense to sexual harassment claims. So if you don't do an investigation, then you don't have that opportunity to correct the behavior and come up with those corrective opportunities for the employee to take advantage of, which are required under the defense. So we'll talk about internal versus external investigations briefly in just a moment, but assuming that you'll start with an internal one is probably part of your sexual harassment policy if you have one, and if it's not, it should be. But the first step is who's going to do the investigation. You want to make sure it's somebody who can investigate objectively without bias in the situation. So probably not the best friend of the alleged harasser. You want somebody that doesn't have a personal stake in the situation and doesn't have personal relationships that are really deep with the parties who are allegedly involved. Somebody who has skills or knowledge of investigations is definitely helpful if you have that. And somebody that just can generally build a rapport with the people that are being interviewed, who has attention to detail, and also really importantly, who can maintain confidentiality of the status of the investigation and potentially the outcome. Next, you want to just create a plan. So don't just necessarily jump into this without any sort of agenda or goals. Think about who should be interviewed and why. What are the allegations that are being made? What should you ask people? That way you're making sure you're collecting the information that needs to be collected and interviewing the people that need to be talked to. And again, we could probably spend a full hour on investigations. This is all very cursory. But taking those planning steps is really an important element here. Lastly, of course, after the investigation is complete, think about whether there's any remedial action needed, whether it's disciplinary or moving people around in the workplace, taking those actions as appropriate, and maintaining the confidentiality of the results to the extent possible. It's not necessarily practical or realistic to promise that results and the investigation can remain confidential in its entirety, but it is important to do so to the extent possible to maintain the integrity of that and protect those who are involved in it, keeping the information on a need-to-know basis. So internal versus external investigations, when we talk about that, we're talking about, is this something done by your HR department or your in-house counsel versus an outside firm or outside counsel? It really depends on the situation, what makes the most sense. Consider who's involved in the allegations. Sometimes an external investigation might be a good idea if you have people really high up in the organization who are involved, if it's people in the HR department itself, if there's a really widespread problem going on in the organization or it's been going on for years, it might be wise to get somebody else involved. Keep in mind, though, that sometimes you might not know if something is a really widespread problem. Maybe everybody in the warehouse might know that, the manager there is, makes really inappropriate comments on a daily basis. But if the HR department is based in a different city, they might not necessarily know that type of behavior is going on a larger scale. It's also important to consider potential discovery and privilege issues. I know we talk a lot about like attorney-client privilege and work product privilege, but keep in mind how having an attorney present, whether it's in-house counsel or an external counsel, can impact the discoverability of investigation documents and communications among people in the workplace, depending on whether there's going to be an attorney-client privilege that applies, or whether documents are created as part of litigation rather than just part of internal policies for investigation. So, anticipating those issues in advance can be really helpful in preparing to defend against a claim. So it can be helpful to consult counsel before engaging in an investigation or during one to anticipate those problems. And that is all I have. Beth, did you have anything to add there?
No, I appreciate everybody participating in this with us. It's a huge topic. It's of important relevance, and we're always available if you would like to ask any type of question offline. You have our contact information, and frankly, many of you probably know us quite well anyway. So please feel free to reach out. And thank you very much for sharing this time with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.